My talk is called Inspired by Our Ancestors, and the subtitle is Using the Past to Inspire the Present in Order to Build a Better Future. And so, yeah, I'll kick off. You know, as I said, when you tell somebody that you went to school and you lived in Sierra Leone in the 1960s to 1970, it really doesn't say half of what you're really trying to get into. But then you have to go deeper in order to get them to understand. Because for me, and for those of us of my generation who grew up in Sierra Leone, we consider these kind of the 10 most crucial years in the nation's history. I mean, open to challenge, of course. But, you know, when we saw Black Panther and we thought, hey, this Wakanda, it kind of sounds like this area we thought we were going to grow up in. You know, and really, that's the truth. And, you know, why do I say this? Well, at those years, you know, everything was fresh and new, not just in Sierra Leone, but in Africa. If you consider that in 1960 alone, 17 African countries gained independence. Sierra Leone got independence a year later. But so this was a time when, you know, there was a kind of firmament. And honestly, you know, growing up in Sierra Leone at that time, we lived in a country where it wasn't even a case of the sky's the limit. We actually thought beyond that. And I can tell you, when it was announced by John Kennedy that, you know, one day America would land a man on the moon, you know, with complete nonchalance, we just said in Sierra Leone, yeah, one day maybe we'll do that too. And to us at the time, it didn't seem ridiculous. However, if you've lived in Sierra Leone recently, it sounds like the most ridiculous fantasy. And so how did we get to that stage from 1961 to where we are now, where once we could dream the most outrageous dreams, and now it's almost like you're not allowed to dream at all. You know, so those dreams we had by 1970 were already beginning to fade and become tarnished. And eventually, I have to say, those dreams died. But this talk is it's not one about despair, because I'm one of those romantics who believe that we actually can get back to those heights, but there's a collective will that needs to be employed in order to do that. You think of our national motto, unity, freedom, justice. And honestly, if you look back over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there have been times when we've had precious little of any of those. So because this is Arts and Culture Fest, I'm actually going to, at the end, talk about some of the things that arts and culture can do to actually change the narrative and turn things around. Because really, if you think about it, a nation's history should not just be about its politicians. And they're not the only ones who've inspired generations. Imagine you were doing a story about Jamaica. These days, would you really leave out Bob Marley, Dennis Brown, Morgan Heritage, Usain Bolt? No, you wouldn't. If you're doing something about Brazil, you would mention Jogo Bonito, you know, the beautiful game, as Pele called it, football. You'd mention Pele, you'd mention Samba, you'd mention Bossa Nova. And so, you know, arts, culture, sports, these can be some of the things that we can use to actually recover some of the kind of lost glory, as I call it. And really, we don't want to build more destructive bombs than anybody else, because, you know, we leave that to the Americans and the Chinese. But anyway, why would we want to do that? It's not what it's about. And so I'm going to frame it around some important, interesting Sierra Leoneans that I think us Sierra Leoneans and the world need to know more about in order to use their lives and how they lived to actually inspire us for the present in order to build this great future that I think is not lost. So the first person I'm mentioning is Samuel Benjamin Thomas, S.B. Thomas. Now, S.B. Thomas, he came up with the idea, imagine, in the late 1890s, just as we were coming to 1900s, to build an agricultural college. Nobody in sub-Saharan Africa had ever built a college that would study agriculture. And so he ended up, in his will, leaving enough money to build this agricultural college in Mabang. Nowadays, people talk about things like food security, the importance of agriculture. Well, he didn't just talk it, he actually walked the walk. This guy, Samuel Benjamin Thomas, was a native of Wellington. And at the time, he was said to be one of the richest Africans in Sierra Leone. And he was a bit of a recluse. He actually died in 1901. And so he didn't live to see the college built. But he left between 50 to 60,000 pounds in his will. That's equivalent to millions these days. And there was an interesting phrase in his will. He said, the college should be for the education of male natives of the colony, aforesaid in the theory and practice of profitable farming and agriculture, and to equip the college with all the necessary appliances and appoint thereto complete professors and teachers to provide them with adequate salaries to secure in due course locally an institution as useful and effective as any in England or America. Imagine a Sierra Leonean thinking that. This is somebody who died in 1901. And the college is there. There are some images which show the college as it now is. We're trying to get a UNESCO fund to actually get it up and running again. And, you know, this is somebody who, he thought big. And all the people I'm going to mention, these were people who thought beyond the kind of narrow circles. As I say, imagine somebody in 1900 thinking that you could build a college that was going to be the equivalent of anything they had in America or in England. You know, now, honestly, do we ever think that we could build something that would be the equivalent or better than something in America or in England? We don't. So where did we lose that spirit of thinking and dreaming big? Now, the next person I'm going to mention is Baibure. Everybody thinks they know Baibure's story. He rebelled against the Hot Tax War. He took up guerrilla tactics to resist the imposition of he was captured, he was exiled, and of course, eventually he was allowed to return home. And really, the thing was, the reason he rebelled and the reason why somebody and some of the people in the colony of Freetown actually opposed him and even helped to kind of fight against him was that, as he said, he was born there. His parents were born there. His grandparents were born there. It was their land. Why should somebody come and tell him to pay tax on something that he built, that they did not even help him to build? And that was part of a spirit of rebellion. And, you know, when he came back from exile, people started thinking that maybe this Baibure guy wasn't so crazy after all. Maybe he had something, a spark in him that should actually inspire us to actually one day self-determine our own futures. After all, why were we building these fine educational establishments? What for, if not to actually one day take charge of our own affairs? The next person I'm going to talk about, some of you know already, Ella Koblo Gulama. You know, she was a Sierra Leonean paramount chief and a politician. And though it's always mentioned that in 1957, she became the first elected member of parliament in Sierra Leone, she was already involved in Sierra Leonean politics nationally and internationally. Now remember, the Second World War ended in 1945. Many Africans fought and died in that war. But they also saw that white people who had come and ruled us and dominated us, they bled and they died just like us. But also, there was a feeling of we had gone and fought in somebody else's war. And now was the time for us to actually, as in the case of Baibure, take charge of our own affairs. So in 1948, 3 years after the Second World War ended, there was a conference, and this was before the days of the internet and everything else. But the British colonies actually contacted each other, said, let's go to London and hold a conference about self-determination. This was in 1948. This is a good 9 years before Ghana became the first of those countries to actually gain independence. And Ella Koblo Gulama was one of the people who represented Sierra Leone as a delegate in that conference in 1948. She was 27 years old. And, you know, this was a time when, you know, the British colony had gained its, none of them had gained their independence. And many had fought and they said, well, you know, this is it. And when she came to London, the British press were fascinated by her. They were fascinated by her eloquence, her style, and just the elegance with which she carried herself. And so There were lots of articles about her in 1948. There are lots of photographs of her taken in England, some of which I shared on Facebook and on Twitter recently. Some of them you have to excuse the captions when you see them because they got some of the captions wrong. They said her husband was the chief of Sierra Leone. Of course, there's no such chiefdom called Sierra Leone. But she went on to become the first female cabinet minister in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the other people I will mention later on, Sir Milton Margai, was the person who I appointed her to that position. And he is somebody who, because he was a quiet and he wasn't an abrasive politician, I think sometimes his legacy is underplayed and undersold. And the reason I've included him as one of the people who should inspire us is because I think, yes, he was our first prime minister at independence, but he was so much more than that. And when I say some of the things that he did, then you'll probably understand why. And the next person I'm mentioning is Frances Claudia Wright. She was a prominent Sierra Leonean lawyer, and apparently she was known as West Africa's Portia. Now, those of you who studied law know how difficult it is to study law and be called to the bar. Imagine, she came to the UK and was called to the bar at the age of 22. She went back to Sierra Leone and had a very, very successful career as a barrister. And she lived on, and she died April 2010. Look at her legacy, look at her life, and learn from it. Now, the next person here I'm going to mention had quite a kind of complex relationship with Sierra Leone, and that's John Joseph Akar. He was an entertainer, he was a writer, he was a diplomat, and it was interesting. Before we started this broadcast, we started with a song which started with the words of the national anthem, but not the tune of the national anthem. Well, John Joseph Akar, who was born in Rotifunk, is actually the person who wrote the music to our national anthem. And in 1964 or 65, he came to London and he brought the National Dance Troupe, which he had formed. And he had formed it for a reason, and the reason I've included him here in Slackfest is because if you look at the project that he wrote to the government about why we should have a national dance troupe, he said that we are a country with a rich and diverse history and culture that shouldn't just be kept to ourselves. We should share it and broadcast it with the rest of the world. This was somebody thinking like that in the 1960s. And so when he came to England, there was something of a kind of a diplomatic standoff because everywhere they had performed with the young women in the troupe performing bare-breasted. And the Minister of Works objected to it, said it would offend British sensibilities. And there was a kind of standoff between him and John Akar. But he won in the end, and they actually ended up on ITV. And in those days, there were only two channels. There was BBC One and there was ITV. And on their show on ITV, they went topless. And so he won that particular battle. Now, despite the fact that he wrote the music to our national anthem, set up our national dance troupe, the reason I say there was a complex side to him. Immediately after independence, 1 year after independence, there was a change to our constitution. It was amended. So instead of it saying that anyone born in Sierra Leone before the date of independence and thereafter was entitled to full citizenship, it was changed. And I can tell you, I've done research. It is the only African country which has this phrase, that full citizenship in Sierra Leone, including the ability to be elected, is only available to people of full Negro African blood. He challenged it in court. He said, at independence, I was Sierra Leonean fully. A year later, you are saying that I am no longer. That case he challenged in 1962. It went all the way until 1969, when it was heard at the Privy Council in London, and he won. But it was something of a Pyrrhic victory because when Shaka Stevens ushered in the uh, Republic, they reinserted that clause. So even though Accra had won it, unfortunately, that clause still resides in our constitution. And I challenge you to find anything in any other African constitution where it says that the only people who are entitled to full citizenship, including the ability to be elected or voted for in an election, have to be on pure Negro African blood. No other African country has that in it. And so it's not all roses, sweetness, and light.